feeling ready to go. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to episode 2 of Wonky Weekly.
I'm Rashaan James II.
And I'm Sid Solomon. Let's wonk it up. Was that better than last time?
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm never going to get it right. Never. Rashaan's very nice to me.
It's time to get wonky.
I don't know. Only if that dance makes it in. All right. So hi again, Rashaan.
Hi.
So I did want to address really quickly, we left an open-ended question in last week's episode, which is about serving on equity committees and in communities and action teams, and whether or not being in conflict of interest as an equity member affects your ability to serve. We're not 100% sure what the answer is yet. What we do know is that to serve either on a committee or in a community or an action team, you do need to be a member in good standing, which means that your dues need to be paid up, which would include taking advantage of the union's current payment plan. But as soon as we find out the answer, we will post it in the comments where these videos are posted. I guess we'll do it for both episode 1 and for this episode, just so we have all of our bases covered. But this is a good example of sometimes we just don't know the answers, and we'll find them out as quickly as we can and get them to you as quickly as we can.
What are we talking about today, Sid?
So today we are talking about the difference between equity counselors, equity convention delegates, and equity staff.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have this experience, Rashaan. When I talk to members at large, especially people who are not particularly involved in equity governance, they don't know what all of these functions are.
Yes, they don't know the difference between what we do. And you are a delegate right now, yes?
Yes, I am currently serving as a delegate to the Equity Convention, whereas you, Rashaan, are a member of the National Council.
Absolutely. I am an Eastern Chorus counselor.
Right. But you are also, in your function as a counselor, a delegate to the convention.
I am, but automatically.
Right. But neither of us are members of equity staff.
Correct.
So this feels very much like a squares and rectangles kind of situation where you can be one thing, but not necessarily the other thing, but sometimes you're both and sometimes you're neither. So let's start with the council. In this country, in the United States, unions are required to be democracies, and they're required to be member run and driven. And at Actors Equity, our national union representing more than 50,000 stage managers and actors, we elect a governing body, a national governing body called the National Council, which has 83 members. Those 83 members are made up of 75 counselors and then 8 officers, all of whom are members of the National Council and all of whom have 1 vote each in a council meeting. So when you all have a meeting at the National Council, if there is a question that comes up for debate and then a vote, there are 83 potential people who could vote, and each person, no matter what their title is, whether they're a counselor or an officer, they get a vote. So Rashaan, you mentioned that you serve currently as an Eastern Chorus counselor. When
Yes.
I was on the council, I was an Eastern principal counselor. So you can already tell from those names that the counselor positions on the National Council are divided between region and work category. We have counselors from our Eastern region, our Central region, and our Western region. We have counselors representing the 3 different work categories found on equity contracts. That's principal actors, chorus actors, and stage managers. We also have a handful of counselors who are defined as at-large counselors, and those are counselors who are specifically counselors living in places in the United States that are outside our 3 main office cities. That's New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. So you might have, and we do have, Eastern principal counselors. We have Central chorus counselors. We have Western stage manager counselors. We have Central at-large counselors. And that's all in addition to our 8 officer positions. I'm going to quiz you, Rashaan. Can you name all 8 officer positions off the top of your head?
Ooh, maybe. President, first vice president, second vice president, third vice president, secretary, treasurer, Western, Central, Eastern vice presidents. Is that all of them?
That's all of them. That's 8.
Ah!
Now, here's a major misconception, Rashaan. You are an Eastern Chorus counselor. Do you only represent the interests of Eastern members who work on chorus contracts?
No. As a counselor, since I am nationally elected, I represent everyone. I am just elected to a seat for Eastern Chorus councilors.
Right. So this is not like, say, the House of Representatives in the United States, where, I have a congressperson who represents my district here in Manhattan, in New York City, and also parts of Brooklyn. And his job when he goes to Congress is to vote in the interest of his specific constituents. He's supposed to go up to the floor of the House and say, my constituents want this, and therefore I'm going to vote in this way. Like you said, Rashaan, we have a national union and we are represented by a national council, which means that every member of the union gets to vote for every single member of the council. So because I get to vote for who serves as a Western stage manager counselor or a central chorus counselor, despite the fact that I am primarily an Eastern principal actor, all of those counselors are required by law to represent my interests as much as any other member of the union's interests. That is one of the functions of us being a nationally governed union. So we don't have a system of proportional representation so much as we have a system of proportional allotment, as I like to call it. The goal being to have a national council that is as representative as possible, at least when it comes to region and work category and living outside of Equity's office cities, as we can. So a council that hopefully looks like the makeup of the membership, but one where everybody represents everybody's interests equally. So that's the makeup of the council, 83 people, all of whom are members of the union. Every member of the National Council is a member, they're in good standing, and they're not in conflict of interest. Equity also has, in addition to the National Council, which handles all union national policy, we also have 3 regional boards: an Eastern Regional Board, a Central Regional Board, and a Western Regional Board, which are basically committees. And they're committees made up exclusively of the members of the National Council from those regions. So the Eastern Regional Board is made up exclusively of the members of the National Council who come from the East, whether they are counselors or officers. The Western Regional Board is made up exclusively of the counselors from the Western region and the officers who come from the Western region. And then the Central Regional Board is just a little bit different. It's made up of all of the counselors who are elected from the Central region. And then the members in the Central region get to elect a handful more people to sit on that regional board. Because the Central region is the smallest of our 3 regions, it has the smallest number of counselors. And so to have a slightly larger regional board, to make sure we have enough people there on a monthly basis when they meet, the members in the Central specifically elect what are called non-counselor Central Regional Board members, which is a title which I think is very self-explanatory. So if we are a nationally governed union, why do we have regional boards? Essentially, it's for efficiency's sake. The National Council has decided that in general, when there is a matter of union policy that is exclusive to one region and one region only, in general, it gives that authority to handle that policy, those policy matters, to the regional board, and the regional board can do it on its own. Now, if something comes up and someone on the Eastern Regional Board says, hey, I think this should actually go to the entire council for discussion and debate, we can do that. But at the end of the day, it's very important to remember, all policy, all responsibility for policy sits with the entire National Council. So Rashaan, you and I, we have only ever been from the East on the council. And things happen in the Western Regional Board that we are not a part of that decision-making process. Things happen in the Central Regional Board. We're not in those rooms and those decisions are being made, but you and I still bore all of the responsibility for those decisions. As members of the National Council, we didn't get to say somebody else made that call. The ultimate responsibility lies with the council. We are the board of directors of the union when we sit on the council, and the buck stops with us. We have elections for the National Council where we elect the members that we want to serve. They happen every 2 years, and they are governed by very strict federal laws that really minutely dictate how those elections are supposed to occur and what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. That's one of the reasons why when you run for council, when you vote for council, you have to vote by mail. physical mail. And I am certain, Rashaan, that we will do an episode at some point where we talk about the election process and why it is the way that it is. Let's just sort of run down when you become a councilor. What are a councilor's responsibilities? You are serving on the board of directors of your union. A union, very technically speaking, is a 501c5 labor organization, a nonprofit organization as defined by the tax code. A councilor is a member of the board of directors. You are overseeing the policy making of the union. Policy meaning rules and goals and everything in between, by which all members of the union, by choosing to become a member, are bound to follow. When you are a councilor, you have a fiduciary responsibility to the union and its members. You have the ability to serve as the chair of a committee. You have the right to attend all council meetings and to have one vote in those council meetings. You are required by law to represent the interests of every single member of the union when you vote. But as a councilor, you are a policy maker. You, along with the other 82 members of the team that make up the National Council, you help to set the policy of the union. And then here comes the segue. You are responsible for overseeing the execution of that policy by the union's executive director. So this is actually a really exciting time to talk about this because we have just gotten a new executive director at Actors Equity. Al Vincent Jr. has just taken over as executive director of Actors Equity. I don't know about you, Rashaan. I'm really excited about it.
I'm so excited. I mean, how his contract started February 1st. It's also Black History Month. Let's go.
So Al Vincent Jr., I haven't met him, and I come from a very strict household where we're not allowed to call grown-ups by their first name until they invite us to. So I don't want to call him Al, although he seems like my friend already. But so Executive Director Vincent, he is responsible. His job as the executive director of the union is to implement and execute the policy that is established by the National Council. So as a member-driven union, members elect their fellow members to serve on the council. The council establishes the rules and the policies of the union, and then we hire a staff to execute that policy. The council directly hires the executive director, and that's a process we just went through. Maybe someday we'll talk in detail about that. And that's a process actually dictated by our Constitution and bylaws. So Executive Director Vincent's job is to look at the policies, look at the rules of the union, and then to say, I'm going to implement them, I'm going to enforce them. And so the executive director is at the top of the food chain when it comes to the staff's job of enforcing that policy. And then the council, as the board of directors, oversees the performance of the executive director. So the executive director is at the very top of that food chain, and then we have a number of staff members who sit below that on our org chart. We have assistant executive directors who are one rung below Al Vincent Jr. So then below the assistant executive director level, depending on which direction and which department you're going into, we have positions like senior business reps, who are people who oversee teams of business representatives. We have business representatives, of course, who are sort of the frontline people working with our members when they're working on a contract. We have directors in various different policy areas. We have specialists in different policy areas. And I honestly, as a former member of the National Council, I don't know the staff org chart as intimately as I know the council org chart. But we have a large staff, all of whom are labor professionals. They are paid. They are employees of Actors Equity Association. Many of them are union members themselves. And I mean that in two different ways. A lot of people who are members of Actors Equity end up working on the staff of Actors Equity. But also, many people who work for Actors Equity are members of their own unions who represent them in their contract negotiations with Equity. So Equity as an organization, as a company, is an employer that negotiates with other unions for the benefits and wages and working conditions for the employees that work for Equity as well. We have historically, at least I should say, had quite a large staff. Our staffing took a significant hit during COVID, and it is slowly beginning to rebound. But there has been a significant amount of shuffling of what departments and what areas people are working in as we slowly move ourselves back up to full speed. Officers, and this is a super wonky thing. I'll go off on a detour for just a second. In legal parlance, officer with a small o when it comes to labor law refers to anybody who serves on the governing body of a union. So every member of the National Council is a small o officer of Actors Equity. Internally at Actors Equity, in the way we discuss the names of the positions of our counselors, we refer to our capital C counselors as counselors. That's the 75 folks. And then our 8 officers as capital O officers, capital O officers. That's the president, 6 vice presidents, and the secretary treasurer. So sometimes we use those terms interchangeably, but small O officer refers to everyone on the National Council. So Rashaan, you and I have been a part of the establishment of lots of different policies at Equity. You have served on a number of different negotiating teams. So that's setting contract policy. You've gone into, you've taken the members' lead in terms of what they want to accomplish in a contract, and then those terms get written into a contract, and then that is the contract. So when a member goes and works on a contract, say they think that their employer is violating the terms of their contract, they don't call you, because it's not your job to enforce the contract. You, as a counselor, as a small O officer of the union, your job was to help to set the goals for what we should get in that contract and then achieve it at the bargaining table. The staff's job, the business representative's job, is to enforce it. So when you are a member working on a contract, if you've got a question or a concern, or you think your contract needs to be enforced, you call a staff member. You call your business rep, a labor professional whose job is to deal with your employer and enforce that contract. That to me is the most straightforward way to explain it. Your counselors are I'm pointing to myself, I'm not a counselor. Your counselors, Rashaan, are the people whose job it is to affect change within the union's policy. I don't think my employer is following the contract. I think my employer is paying somebody under the table to avoid my favored nations rider. I think my employer is creating an unsafe workplace. Those are matters of execution of the policy, of the contracts. That's a matter for the staff. That's what we pay them for. They are labor professionals who are there to serve us in executing the rules and the contracts of the association.
So, Sid, you said, we know that the National Council is elected by the membership, and we know that the National Council chooses the ED in a very, very wonky process that's outlined in the Constitution. Who is in charge of staff in total, the rest of staff other than the executive director, when it comes to hiring?
When it comes to hiring, the executive director. The executive director is essentially responsible for the entirety of the staff side. And it's up to the executive director. And this is like any company or organization. The executive director gets to decide how he wants to delegate responsibility. So I doubt, I don't know, it's his prerogative. I doubt that Al is going to personally oversee, I called him Al, Executive Director Vincent is going to oversee the specific hiring of every single staff member who comes along. But he has tasked people who work for him with doing that. But in general, when it comes to staff side operations, the buck stops with the executive director. And then when it comes to overseeing the entirety of the execution, the buck stops with the council. So the council oversees the executive director, but the executive director only. You as a member of the National Council, collectively with your 82 fellow teammates, oversee the executive director's job performance. That does not mean you can walk into a staff member's office and say, do this. And it is a very common thing, especially in nonprofit organizations and especially in nonprofit arts organizations, for there to be what I often call board overreach, where board members think that they have the authority to tell individual staff members what to do. And that is never okay.
And I think that brings us back to a point about the council. Everyone has a single vote, but what happens once a vote goes in? What happens once we've approved something? What is the decision of the National Council? What does that mean? So say I vote no to it. What is my responsibility as a counselor?
So do you mean when you vote no to something that ultimately ends up passing?
Yes.
Sure. So I don't know about you, Rashaan, but I have certainly been on the losing end of some votes in the National Council. I know you have too. Everybody has. And, that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. I was just having this conversation with somebody the other day. Solidarity is a word we use all the time in the labor movement, and solidarity is super important. Solidarity and unanimity are not the same thing. A governing body that disagrees about things, that has votes that are not unanimous, does not mean that you are a governing body that is, not in solidarity with each other, but rather you represent the interests of 50,000 plus different workers, all of whom are opinionated and all of whom are never going to agree about everything. And so you wouldn't want a council that always agrees about everything, because that wouldn't really be reflective of our members. I don't know if you've ever talked to an equity member or a group of equity members, Rashaan, but very often they don't agree about things, and that's okay. That's good. When you are on the losing side of a vote, when the majority passes, and that is the policy of the union, that's the policy of the union. You as a member, just a member, let alone a counselor, you as a member are bound by the policies of the union. If the membership rule passes that you don't like, you still have to follow the rule. If a priority that you really wanted to get into contract negotiations doesn't get in there, then it hasn't gotten in there. You can try again the next time. If a contract that you didn't want ratified gets ratified, that's still the collective bargaining agreement that is in place. You don't have to be happy about it. You have the right to tell anybody that you want to that you would prefer that union policy look a different way. And in fact, I mean, we have elections. So when elections come up, if you as a counselor want to run on the fact that there are policy decisions that you disagreed with, and if you elect me and elect, this person, maybe we'll get enough people who think the way I think that policy at the union will change later on. That's democracy. When I served on the council, I mean, there were only ever 83 of us at a time, but over the 5 years I served with, more than probably 175, 200, 225 different counselors. Every single one of them wanted the best for the union. Every single one of them wanted the best for each and every one of Equity's members. I agreed with some more than others. I disagreed with some almost all the time. You and I have voted opposite ways on plenty of issues. And sitting next to each other in council is the best thing ever, because, you get up and I expect you're going to say, I'm in favor of this. And you say you're opposed. I'm like, I can't believe that. Tell me, explain. And if you didn't convince me when you got up, it would still give me pause. I'm like, wow, Rashaan disagrees with me. Maybe I'm really backwards on this. And to me, this is you hear me say this all the time. That's the way it's supposed to work. But at the end of the day, the policy set by the council is the policy of the union. And it is the policy of the union until it changes. And as a member, as a counselor, it's your job to respect that, even if you disagree with it, and to abide by it.
Absolutely. You talked about this idea of solidarity, which can bring us really great into our next conversation. We had a national convention, which is it's almost brand new. It's only 1 year old-ish. Yeah. And last year's slogan for the convention was solidarity in a new era. So we have the convention, and we've talked about the other two things. We have staff and council. Talk to me a little bit about delegates, what they do, who they are, and how they fit into the big puzzle that is equity.
Sure. So like you said, the convention is brand new, So I am, for instance, as you said, I am a delegate to Equity's convention. And the makeup of the convention looks like this. Every member of the National Council gets to serve as a delegate to the convention. So that's 83 delegates right there. So they are counselor delegates because they are counselors, and therefore, because they're counselors, they're delegates. We then also elect 100 additional delegates who are, again, proportionately allotted based on region, Eastern, Central, and Western, and category, principal, chorus, and stage manager, in the same kind of math formula as happens with the council. So 100 delegates who are elected based on region and also job category. So for instance, I am currently serving as an Eastern principal delegate to Equity's conventions. And then we have an additional 28 delegates, each of whom is elected from one of our liaison areas. And for anyone who doesn't know what a liaison area is a town or a city or a metropolitan area or even sometimes larger than a metropolitan area in the country that has more than 100 Equity members living within it. So that can be some of our biggest liaison areas are places like Boston, and Baltimore, Washington, D.C. has a joint liaison area, Atlanta, Georgia, Minneapolis and St. Paul, Denver. So these are just some examples of.
Sid, you missed Buffalo, Rochester. You
I'm
have
sorry.
to
I
say Buffalo,
can't.
Rochester.
I
You're
can't believe in picking. So I wanted to spread it out geographically. Yes, Rashaan is from Buffalo, so he has a very soft spot for the Buffalo Rochester liaison area, as do I. As a means of making sure that the desires of the members living specifically in those liaison areas are heard, we also elect one person as a delegate from each of those 28 liaison areas. So 83 councilor members, 100 delegates elected proportionately from across the country and across the work categories, and then 28 liaison delegates. Here's a big difference, though. When it comes to the 100 delegates from across the country, it is not like the council elections where everybody votes for everybody. The convention was designed so that only people from the East are voting for the Eastern delegates. Only people from the Central region are voting for the Central delegates, and only people from the Western region are voting for the Western delegates. This is for two reasons. We wanted the convention, the council, I should say, the council decided that the convention should be more specifically reflective of the desires of people based on where they live. And so, again, the regional voting is done regionally, so you can only vote for the people from your region. And then when it comes to the liaison delegates, only people living in those liaison areas get to vote for those delegates. The second reason is because we can. And this is a very important distinction between delegates and councilors. I mentioned the fiduciary responsibility, the legal fiduciary responsibility that councilors have to the union, and the very strict labor laws that govern the way in which a governing body, as defined by the law, is elected. The convention is not the union's governing body. We'll talk a little bit more about what the convention does, but it's very important to know convention delegates do not have a fiduciary responsibility to the union, and they are not members of the union's governing body. And so different federal laws apply, or more specifically, the federal laws pertaining to elections of union officers, small o officers, do not apply, which means that not only can, in a national union structure, can we do localized voting, we can also do that voting via electronic ballot. And this is a big thing we hear every election cycle, Rashaan. How come I can vote for convention delegates via electronic ballot, but I cannot vote for my councilors via electronic ballot? I have to do it via mail. That is a distinction of the law. It's a frustrating one. It is, in fact, one that is designed to hamper the ability of unions to conduct their elections efficiently, but it is simply the case. Another big difference between the convention and council, we have mentioned that council is one person, one vote. If you are a member of the council, you show up, you get one vote in the council meeting. Not quite the same thing in the convention. It's a much more complicated voting structure. It's a weighted voting structure, which I don't think I will explain in its entirety right now. But essentially, it means that if people are not able to attend the convention, their vote doesn't get thrown away. It gets weighted in with all of the other people from their region. So all of the people voting from the Eastern region combined collectively will always have the same amount of voting power, no matter how many of them are actually able to show up. Same thing for Central, same thing for Western. And we have an even slightly more complicated thing when it comes to our liaison delegates, where if one of them is not able to be present, they may give their vote by proxy to another liaison delegate. But again, part of this is legal, where we are allowed to have more complex structures to have outcomes that are designed to be more reflective of local and hyperlocal desires and needs when it comes to policy. But also, again, because we're not talking about a governing body and the way in which a union is governed. These are things that the union is allowed to do in the establishment of that. All right. So what is the purpose of the convention? And for this, I'm going to go directly to the union's constitution and bylaws, which you can find, again, in the member portal in the governance section. So I am looking right now at the Constitution, and I'm looking at Article 4 of the Constitution. The title is Convention. Section 2 of Article 4 says, and I'm just going to read this, authority of convention. The decisions of the convention shall be binding on the National Council, the national officers, the regions, the liaison areas, all committees, and the members of the union. The convention shall have the authority not expressly reserved to the National Council under Article 3, Section 1A, 1 through 14. Its authority shall include, but shall not be limited to, adopting resolutions, increasing initiation fees and dues, and approving amendments to this Constitution as provided in Article 6, Section 2 of the Constitution. And again, if I'm super fancy, I'm going to figure out how to do some titles underneath the pictures here. So let's start with that right there. The convention is allowed to adopt resolutions, which means that people are allowed to put ideas onto the floor of the convention, and then we debate them, and then we decide whether or not they should be adopted. So the convention, so a person goes to the floor of the convention and says, I think we should say the convention wants this. And then we vote. And if we agree to it, then that is a convention resolution. The convention says this should be the case. All right. Increasing initiation dues and fees. This was a big change for the union. We used to only ever be able to increase union dues via a direct member referendum. As of right now, the convention has been given the authority to raise dues if the convention sees fit. That is a big change that happened when we created the convention. And then also approving amendments to the Constitution. The union's Constitution is its sort of foundational governing document, and changes to the Constitution are and should be very hard to make. But the convention does have a process by which the Constitution can be amended. Now, all of that said, I'm going to go down to Article 3, Section 1A, 1 through 14, which is where the authority of the National Council is outlined in the Constitution. And this is really important because these are the things that only the council may do. It's a list. I'm going to read it to you. To interpret and enforce the Constitution, to adopt the union's financial plan and budget, to cause the union to enter into mutual assistance and cooperation agreements with other unions, to approve collective bargaining proposals, collective bargaining agreements, amendments thereto, and waivers, to call a strike of the membership in accordance with established policies, to order a membership referendum in accordance with Article 7 of the bylaws, to make all decisions regarding the employment of an executive director as set forth in Article 3, Section 6 of the bylaws, to adopt and oversee the implementation of the union's organizing strategy, to exercise the union's appointment and removal power with respect to representatives of all entities and organizations in which the union participates, including but not limited to the appointment and removal of the union trustees on the equity benefit funds, to propose constitutional amendments for the convention's or membership's consideration, to establish committees and approve the appointment of committee members and chairs, to hear and determine appeals from charges against any member in accordance with the procedures set forth in Article 10, Section 5 of the bylaws, to recommend an increase in dues to the convention or membership, and finally, to adopt such policies and procedures as the National Council deems necessary or appropriate for the governance or operations of the union. That's a lot. So, Rashaan, you were at our first convention as a councilor delegate.
Yes.
I was at the first convention as a delegate, a regional delegate. There were lots of resolutions that were brought forth that talked about things pertaining to that list of 14 things that are specifically in the council's purview, talking about organizing strategy, talking about what we should be trying to be achieving in contracts, talking about what the financial priorities of the union should be. Convention delegates wanted to express their desires for the way in which the council would act. But the convention itself doesn't have the authority to tell the council how to act with regards to those policy matters, because those things are expressly given to the council as their authority. So what did we end up doing? When there were things that the convention delegates wanted to express, but weren't things that they could do directly, were they told, we're just not going to talk about them?
No.
No. What did the convention end up doing?
Sent resolutions saying the convention recommends to council to ... whatever it is.
Okay. As of right now, Rashaan, and there are some things that are confidential that you can't share that go on in the council room. How would you say generally the council has responded to, and it was a long list of recommendations the convention made. How would you say it's going so far in terms of how the council has been taking up the recommendations sent by the convention?
I think it's actually going extremely well. What we didn't discuss is that the National Council has a regular meeting once per month.
Yes.
And instead of only having that meeting, in order to expedite getting through a lot of these resolutions, we added several council meetings where they were specific to going through recommendations from the National convention and getting those into either sending them to a committee that has purview over the resolution or discussing them inside of council. So we got through plenty of them pretty quickly, and a lot of them are in the committee structure, and some of them we created new groups, new working groups that some are the chair, like one is like the chair of the ACCA with the vice chairs of the ACCA and the chair of the EPA to talk about auditions. And so we created different working groups so that a lot of these resolutions can be worked on outside of council and then brought back into the room later on. So there's a list of probably about 20 of them I can think of off the top of my head that are done. They have been either approved, they have been changed, or they have been taken by the National Council from the convention and approved in a way or denied in a way. They are done. And then there's several of them that are in the committee structure or in a working group still being worked on. I will say that the process was not only hard because we lost a lot of staff. And because we had lost a lot of staff, that takes up a lot of the work that we need. Because there are times when I say, hey, I need to know the financials on this. And like that's a moment where staff is like, okay, we have to come back to you. So it might take a little bit longer for some things to come back to us because of the fact that we are just now getting closer to the size of our staff from pre-COVID than we were right after COVID hit us pretty hard.
So let me ask you this, Rashaan, and I want to ask you this from your perspective as a counselor and using your own words. And I honestly, we haven't talked about this, so maybe we'll see differently here. As a counselor, how do you think about the role of the convention, given the different way in which it's made up than the council, the different way we elect its delegates than the council, given the powers that it does have, but also the limitations on its powers? What do you see in the simplest possible terms as the best way to explain the purpose of the convention? What does it do for the union?
I think it does several things. I think for one, it streamlines and saves us money. We had lots of meetings and lots of things, and a referendum costs money. We send out a referendum and it costs a lot of money. Now we do it inside of the convention, and we can make a lot of changes in a lot of times with national representation of our membership, not just the 83 people who were elected, but more of those people to save us money in a way. So that's one. Then number two, it gives a broader perspective of things than the National Council has. Yes, we want and we strive for 83 people to be the most diverse group representing members, but it's not. So in essence, by adding the 100 people that are elected nationally, and then especially because of the specific liaison members of the delegation, those people have a very specific mindset that someone like me does not have. I don't work necessarily in the regions. I can represent people in the regions and I can speak to them and I can understand, but I will never intrinsically be a person who lives in Austin, who works only in Austin, who doesn't audition in New York City. So having those people in the room changes the mindset and the whole zeitgeist of how we create policy. So that's great. It diversifies thought. That's another one. Then the next one is it takes away the idea of us not being able to access members in a way that we never could before. There were members of the delegation who said things that I had never heard before, because there's sometimes a disconnect between those who are elected and those who are in the rank and file membership. And me hearing it from those delegates straight out of their mouth in a way while we're creating policy changed the way that I think about the policy.
That's a lot of information we put out on the table today. Staff, paid labor professionals who work for the executive director, the chief executive officer of the staff who reports to and is overseen by the union's council. The council, the board of directors of the union that sets the policy and the rules of the union and then oversees the executive director's execution of those policies. And then the convention, essentially a big group of rank and file members mixed in with the rest of the councilors who have the ability to send resolutions to the council, either instructing the council to do things or highly recommending to the council that they do things that in a perfect world reflect the will of the broader membership. Anything we forgot, Rashaan?
I don't think so. And if we did forget anything, just ask us. We'll bring it up in our next episode.
And we will be back next week with episode 3 of Wonky Weekly. So again, I'm Sid Solomon.
I'm Rashaan James II.
And I promise I'll come up with a better intro slogan for next week. It's going to happen. I'm going to nail it. I promise. All right. Thanks, everyone.
See you later.